Welcome back to the Keeping the Dream Alive podcast. Today I have a familiar face on the podcast. We've had Clay Hagan on the podcast before, but welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thank you, Clark.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking today a little bit about what an ESOP is. I think that's kind of, if anyone is listening that's not a Torch employee, ESOP is a big part of Torch. And if you are a Torch employee, ESOP is a big part of what your day-to-day jobs look like and the career path you have here. So for those who may be listening and don't know what an ESOP is, talk a little bit about just what the basics of what is an ESOP.
Yeah. So an ESOP is an employee stock ownership plan. They say sometimes when you've seen one ESOP, you've only seen one ESOP. And that's because the implementation of that can be a lot of different things. You could be a large or publicly held company and you may incentivize your employees to get stock at discount, and you have an employee stock ownership plan. So it could be a small portion of what you're doing. You could be a private company that's majority owned by one person. They're looking to take a little bit off the table. Maybe they take 30% or so and they put it out for the ESOP. And so the employees have a little bit. And maybe that happens for a while. And then if nobody's leaving, it doesn't recycle. Or you can have a very dynamic one that's 100% owns the company. So the employee stock ownership plan owns all of the outstanding shares, which is where Torch has gotten to. It's not where we started at. We actually started at everybody that came in, including the receptionist, got a stock option. So if there was a path, it was, you could talk about having a stake in the outcome or a marker on the table or a piece of the action. There's all kind of different forms in there. But the important part is that even when Torch began, how do we make sure that those people that lean in extra, that bring extra ideas, extra enthusiasm, extra effort, or their normal effort benefit from what they're creating? So an ESOP is a very broad-ranging implementation. The ESOP, as far as inside the U.S., there's a lot of regulation around that. It's very similar to the retirement plan, 401k, and implementation. And there's a lot of power behind that, particularly in our case when you get to the point that you're 100% ESOP owned. So with that, it's the mechanism of how do you get the employees an opportunity to share in what you're creating.
And I think that's sort of the differentiating factor between companies that maybe aren't ESOPs and companies that are. Yeah. I know that since the beginning, Torch has always wanted to be an ESOP. What was that process like? Obviously you didn't start it being a completely 100% employee owned, but when did that distinction happen? And then kind of what did that look like maybe internally for the company as a whole and as well as for the employees? What did it look like for them?
Yeah. So a lot of people don't know that Torch actually started off as a subsidiary, a spinout of Torch Concepts, which is another company. And so Don Holder and Bill Rourke had founding shares or founding options, for that. And they had a commitment that, from the company that they, had spun off from, took $100,000 seed money. And if they could get to 50 employees, that would be a significant point in time that they could then implement what we call the ESOP. Because obviously with a retirement plan or any plan that's very broad-based, you have expenses to run that each year. And at 50 employees, Bill felt like that ratio would work out to where the amount of administrative side was very much worth, going forward. So initially, you pretty much just had Bill and Don, and then everybody else that came on would get some stock options. But we really had this where we had to hit those milestones. If we didn't get to 50, this whole path is not going to get there. And there's plenty of companies out there that never get to 50 employees. It's not just a given that just because you want that to happen, it will happen. Fortunately, we're in an industry that is consistently profitable. We're selling services, particularly to the government. Research and development is a wonderful place to engage employees where if they have some ownership stake there, that they'll bring extra to their customers and extra to the company. But we got there pretty quickly. I think it was 2004. We passed 50 employees.
Wow.
We'd spun off or launched the subsidiary October 1 of 2002-ish. There may be some certificates where there's some, questions of a day or two, around that, basically in October of 2002. And in 2 years, we'd hit 50 employees. And we did not originally have it set up to do the ESOP in 2004, but we got the paperwork done and got that implemented before April of 2005. And you could go back retroactively. So our first contribution to become an ESOP, kind of do that incremental, was we took 2% of base salary as a benefit, put that to the ESOP. And so that purchased shares, on behalf of the employees. So it's a beneficial ownership. The fact that it's inside a retirement plan, it's inside a trust, the employees benefit from that. It's not, standing outside where they have the certificates in their hand. But before that, so that was the first 2%. And then the next few years, it was maybe 6%, et cetera. And so we're working our way, up through there. And it took multiple years from 2004's contribution through 2011. We were on our path. We were maybe 40-something% owned by the ESOP. They still had founding shares. Don and Bill had founding shares. So, several of us had, options that we either had already cashed out and held the shares, or were, vested to where we could do that. Once the ESOP came in place, the number of stock options went down significantly because that was no longer needed to blanket the ownership across the entire employee space. So it was still there. There's pros and cons with an ESOP, and particularly one that's extremely broad-based. And you say, well, what's some of the pros? Well, the pro is that every single person in the company has a stake in the outcome. The con in that is some of them don't really care, right? So they're getting something that they don't, it's not that they don't value, but they don't value in the way to make a difference in the way they work, right? So everybody appreciates a benefit. Nobody's sitting there going, why did you give me this? But what you really want is that the folks that really will perform better to have those incentives to cause that to come out, where they're taking that energy and putting it into the company that they own part of, as opposed to putting that in energy outside the company or whatever you have there. So a big part of that dynamic, the magic, the huge pro is that you get behavioral changes. You get people bring ideas to the company. People bring more energy to the company. They're servicing their customer and they say, we solved this problem for you. Here's the next 3 problems we could also solve for you. And so they're marketing their own services. They're marketing the company. They're marketing the culture. And when you think about it, all companies are owned. So why wouldn't you want that ownership to be internal and internal focused as far as, motivating, the folks? Because it could be, a wealthy person from Chicago, Illinois could own a company. There's nothing wrong against that. But isn't it better for that ownership to reside inside the folks and inside the organization that's trying to make a difference? Yeah.
And I think, that you alluded to it a little bit a second ago, was that, making a new employee understand the ESOP is probably one of y'all's biggest hurdles or tasks on a daily basis, maybe, especially when recruiting. And I feel like maybe some people that are listening that are new to the company, a question that they probably have is, when will I see the benefit of being an employee-owned company or being part of this ESOP? And how do you go about addressing that?
Yeah, it is a frustration, that people don't value what you perceive that you're giving to them or providing to them. It's just a reality. When you look through the math, and I'm just going to make up some numbers here. These are not numbers necessarily reflective of anything here, but let's just take that maybe you're getting 10% of your salary as a contribution towards the ESOP. The first year, at the end of that year, you have 10% of your salary sitting there in employee ownership. If you were to take 10% of your salary and set it aside to buy a company, that'd be significant the first year. But in reality, even if that grew 20%, that's 2%, right? So, and had it been in the stock market, it might have still grown 10% or whatever it would have grown. It's that delta of the internal growth of the company versus, what's out in the market. So it really, I think, takes until you have at least your full salary in ownership that it gets your attention. We can talk about it all day long. We can emphasize it. However, there are other people. I'm thinking of Jim Moore in particular. He came on board just before I came on board, the company. And this was his first job offer, I think, out of college. I think it was his father-in-law he was talking to about the offer he'd gotten from Torch Technologies, and Torch was going to be a employee-owned company. And his father had worked for an employee-owned company. He said, whatever you do, I don't care what the comparison, and you go be with that company. So he got it before he even got it.
Wow.
In other words, it really, broke all ties, that the fact that he had gotten an offer from a company that was going to be an employee-owned company. And in his case, he had gotten the stock option because we didn't have the ESOP yet at the time. We were heading towards it. So the experience of somebody that he knew and respected caused him to immediately understand how important it was and special it was to be at a company that would then be providing that ownership path, for you. The vast majority of other folks, it really won't be until you're 5 or you're 7, or what I think is at the point in time that your ownership is above 1 times your salary, that it will get your attention. And get your attention in the years that the ESOP grows faster than the market.
Yeah. And it's, I think, you look at trying, I feel like over the last few years, there's more and more ESOPs out there. I think ESOPs probably when y'all, made the decision to be an ESOP, it was a fairly new concept. Now it's from the outskirts, and I think the public perspective, there's a lot more ESOPs. I think the knowledge of probably ESOPs has grown in general, maybe a little bit. But I feel like there's still probably that barrier that you're having to always either some of the new hires' parents understand what an ESOP is, and they relay that to their son or their daughter, and they say, okay, yes, no matter what, stay there, do whatever you can to not lose that job, kind of thing. Is there like a preconceived idea about an ESOP, or a question that you get often with maybe hires that have been here for a few years, as well as maybe new hires that ask about an ESOP, that you're able to kind of address it, that you maybe get asked often?
So probably the often part being is that people do take the experiences they hear about and assume it's going to continue to apply. So when you think of ESOPs, Dynetics in Huntsville comes to mind, Camber comes to mind. You have others that come to mind. And so for a long time, people assumed that just because you're an ESOP, eventually you're going to sell, right? And, by our joining Evergreen and the Evergreen status and the Public Benefit Corporation, we put some values out there that were different than what others had put out there. And we paid some attention to the fragilities that were created at the other companies that created the need to sell. And employees that were employees of Camber, and got a pop when they sold, and employees that were employees of Dynex got a pop when they sold. Those employees may still want to go to an ESOP, but they may not have that. They may have that assumption that it's going to last for a certain length of time. And there's nothing about an ESOP that says it couldn't last forever. One of the mistakes that some, ESOPs have make is they didn't set aside or hold on to money or invest those earnings when they didn't, if they didn't currently need them. And I think that was pretty much the case with Camber. You out acquiring companies or using the cash. And if you're a business owner, that's what you want to do. You say you don't want to sit on, on cash. You want to put it to use for it to grow as well. But you need to do that in a way that is low risk, has some high liquidity, to it, whether it be through, in our case, doing the freedom real estate where you could mortgage things or whatever. But you don't want to get in a situation where you're upside down on cash, because if you ever have a need, to make the market to buy the shares back, and that exceeds your current year's benefit and your current year's earnings, you don't want to be forced to sell or force some other, situation. So we've tried to learn the lessons of others. You can't. There is no absolute perfect, model for it. You want the ownership to be held by those that really value the ownership. So one of the things that we have done and will continue to do to the extent we can is make diversification as open as possibly can. If we have the cash reserves, the stock reserves, whatever, to where we can allow people to diversify even if they're younger. we want to be able to do that, because if they don't value that ownership, then we'd like them to be able to diversify it. Likewise, we recently put a market in place. For a couple of years in a row now, we put out and said, here's the valuation of the company, here's the current price, here's what we're looking at. If you desire to push from your 401k into the ESOP, you can do that within limits. So likewise, if you had somebody come on board that was maybe mid-career, they had the same 0 ESOP account balance on day one as everybody else. But in that first year, if we happen to have a market, they could push in from their IRA to our 401k and then push into the ESOP and get that marker on the table, for them. So you can call it a catch up, you can call it a tuning. But the ideal situation, what the public market has, is you're only owned by the willing. People can immediately take their markers off the table or put their markers on the table. We can't get there, right? And we don't want to get there. There's lots of turbulence with that. So we're always trying to set and say, how do you balance all these equations where you get the behavioral change, you get the motivational change, you get the benefit change, you actually reward those that are creating the value, and you're held by folks that want to and value what they're holding.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I would assume too, with being that ESOP, as employees that have maybe been here for a while and they get ready to retire, you're having to, almost buy their shares back because of it being an employee owned company, which I would assume affects the valuation and the impact that the ESOP will then make to other employees.
Yes.
Or how does that, I mean, especially Torch has recently celebrated 20 years. You probably have some employees that are getting ready to, wind out their career. How does that affect the ESOP for new employees coming on, as well as employees that have maybe only been here 5 or 6 years?
Yeah. So it's always going to be exciting for new employees coming on that value the ownership, because from now on, there will be employees with significant balances that are retiring. Right. We hired every year. We hired every quarter, of every year. People have stayed around a long time. We haven't had large turnover. So there's now a pipeline of folks that will be retiring in the next 5 years. However, 5 years from now, there'll be a pipeline of folks that are retiring 5 years after that. That when you actually look at everything and you adjust it, I think it's going to be kind of a continual opportunity for those shares to be recirculated. There'll be times where for a year or two, you may decide, okay, we're the current employee benefit is what we're going to limit to. We're not going to have the market, which allow people to buy things. And there's a chance that the retirees may not be paid out in a single year. Right now we're current. So when somebody retires or wants to diversify, they're paid out within that year. We stay current, and we're doing that because we feel like that is the most fiscally responsible thing to do. The ESOP regulations allow you to pay large account balances over a 5-year period, and extremely large account balances over a 10-year period. If not doing so would put a strain on the company. So the fact that an ESOP has to make its own market is one of the biggest delta dynamics from a normal company, because normally a privately held company doesn't make a market until the owner wants to sell, right? And then they put it for market and do that. A public company is having a market made for them every minute of every trading day, right? And so it's in between here. We've got to make our own market, but through our benefit, through our internal market, but also through occasionally using more earnings, retained earnings, to do that. And this year, Torch is making significantly larger than the current benefit contribution to the ESOP. That won't always happen, but it's one of the tools in the toolboxes. So far we've not really had to sell a piece of property or mortgage a piece of property, and we may never have to, right? But all those things have to be on the table when and if it's appropriate to do that. But has the biggest dynamic thing is those coming on board, there's going to be fresh shares available Anybody that joins the company today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, it's going to be a continual stream now.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking the last little bit talking about an ESOP. I think, there's so many different elements of an ESOP. Every ESOP looks a little different. And so having conversations like this that kind of outline what Torch's ESOP is and how it is different and all the things that you've put in place, I think it's pretty incredible. We'll probably have to have you on in the next sometime in 2025 to actually talk through a little bit of how things have changed, because it's continuing to change and continuing to adapt. But I appreciate you being here today.
Sounds good. Thanks, Clark.